So thanks everybody for joining my Watson presentation on the last 12 months when I was studying women's roles in the mountain guiding and trekking industry around the world. I have been thinking a lot about this moment in Argentina at 18,000 feet at Camp 2, and you can see those domes down there. And we were huddled in one of them in the middle of a snowstorm with 50-mile-per-hour wind gusts, trying to decide if we were going to hike up to Camp 3 that day or not. And we needed to if we were going to be able to have a chance at making the summit. And we were there with a French team and also with some of the porters who had carried gear up from base camp. And one of the porters asked us over his tea, what are you doing here? Like, why did you all decide to come here to climb Aconcagua, which is the tallest mountain in South America? And I remember thinking, that's a really good question. um, why am I here at 18,000 feet up on this mountain? I've been having altitude sickness and puking and trying to drag myself and all this gear up this mountain with no plant life and everything all dry. And really, for me, it started when I was 14 and I climbed Tahoma or Mount Rainier for the first time with my dad. And we hiked up to Camp Muir, and then we were going to make a summit attempt that night. And I was the only woman who was at Camp Muir who was there climbing without a guide, and also the only person who was under the age of 30. And the guys were making fun of me. They were calling me Pippi Longstockings because I had awkward braids, and they were commenting on how cute it was. My dad had hiked with me up to the base camp and acting like I wasn't going to be able to make it to the top. And that made me feel very determined, and I did summit and I beat them all to the top. But that made me start thinking about why it was that there were so few women who were up there, and also why there were so few women of color, why it was such a white space, and why that seemed to continue in the other outdoor spaces that I was in. And I wanted to know if that was something that was universal in other parts of the world, or if that was something that was mostly happening here in the places where I had been experiencing the outdoors. And so I was able to get a Thomas J. Watson Fellowship and get funding to go and try to explore those questions. And in the end, I made it to Asia and South America. The trip got cut short because of COVID, but I had time to think and talk to people and do interviews and go on checks with women in different countries in those continents. And some of the questions that I was asking were, are women underrepresented everywhere? Is this universal? Would there be some places where women have equal representation or some places where there are no women guiding at all? I also wanted to understand what factors cause the gender disparities. Are women choosing not to guide, or are women being locked out of the industry? And I also wanted to explore how gender intersects with other identities, like members of the LGBTQIA community and also racial minorities, and how they're impacted by similar factors that make you think of a mountaineer as a strong, older white man. The first place that I went on my trip was India, and I went to northern India in Manali. And there I met a woman named Bhuvi, and she has been working for the last 18 years as a guide and as a professional skier to raise enough money to start Himalayan Women Outdoor, which is a small guiding company, and the goal is to employ local women and also to help urban women get outside, because a lot of the women who live in Delhi or in other major cities don't feel comfortable going on trips with the male guides because there's such strong cultural taboos of going to the bathroom where you could be seen by a man, and also talking to a man about your period, if you got your period while you were on a trip. And she wants to help women feel more comfortable being able to get outside and see other parts of India. One of Bhuvi's mentors whose name is Dickie Dolma, taught movie at the Manali Institute, which is a mountaineering institute located in Manali. And Dickie was the youngest woman to summit Everest at that time when she climbed it in 1993 as part of the Indo-Nepal Women's Everest Expedition. And she was just 19 when she summited Everest. And now she teaches. And she made the active choice to be a teacher and a mentor rather than continuing to guide because she wanted to be able to have time with her kids and spend time at home. And that's a choice that has come up again and again when I talk to women who are in leadership roles in the educating side or women who have decided to leave the industry. It's often because they had to make a choice between spending time with their kids or guiding. And that's not a choice that men bring up nearly as often. There doesn't seem to be this necessity of picking between having a family and being able to have your career. Kirna Sood is another woman who I met in Manali, and she gave up guiding because she wanted to preserve her culture, because a lot of the traditions are carried on by women, the preparations for festivals and the cooking for different cultural events is all done by women. And if she's out in the backcountry for a week at a time, there's no one at home to make sure that those traditions are being carried on. And so she decided to give up her career in order to be able to maintain culture for her family and also for her community, which is also a choice that men very rarely talk about needing to face. After my time in Manali, I took this bus over 5,000-meter passes on a 22-hour bus ride and made it to Ladakh, which is in northern India, in a desert high-altitude region. And I went to the Suru Bouldering Festival to go rock climbing. And I met up with Perna Dongi, who's a pro rock climber and ice climber. And she's co-founder of Climb Like a Woman, or CLAW, which is an all-women's climbing festival located in Hampi, India, in the south. And Perna speaks to young women about adventure all the time, in large part because she didn't feel like she had a mentor figure to look up to. She's the only woman who is able to be a pro climber in India, and she didn't have anyone before her to look up to see how to do it or even to see that it was possible. And so she wants to play that role for other young women and show that they can pursue their dreams and they can make things happen for themselves if they want to. And then she also has a big focus on period education. So when she goes on expeditions in rural parts of India, she'll bring cloth with her and teach girls how to make cloth pads and teach them that they don't need to let their period stop them from getting an education and going to school and being able to do everything else that that the boys can do. And she is a really strong advocate for women being able to access the outdoors in India. The reason I went to Ladakh in the first place was because I wanted to trek with the Ladakhi Women's Travel Company. And it's a company founded by Thinlas Chorol, who is Ladakh's most experienced female guide. And the Ladakhi Women's Travel Company has a big focus on homestay treks, where you trek from high altitude village to village and you stay with people in their homes. And that's because it has a much lower impact on the environment there than the typical trekking where you bring a bunch of mules with you and you set up tents, which ends up disturbing the natural environment. And by staying with families, you're also putting more money back into the local community rather than with guides who often come in from Nepal to work in Ladakh, since the trekking seasons are complementary. What I thought was really cool about the Ladakhi Women's Travel Company is that they only hire women, and client groups have to have a woman in order to book a trip with them, because they don't want to send their guides out with just men, because their guides feel really uncomfortable with that. And they do everything that they can to make sure that their guides are having a positive and empowering experience as well as the clients. Here's some photos from my trek with the Ladakhi Women's Travel Company. I stayed in the woman on the left's house, and she cooked rice and dal, which is lentils, over a fire with yak dung, because that's the most sustainable and easiest to gather fuel source in the desert in Ladakh. I also checked with the Ladakh Family Tour and Travel Company, which a woman named Dolma founded quite recently, and she used to guide for the Ladakhi Women's Travel Company. And I thought that that was such a good example of how the Ladakhi Women's Travel Company was able to train her and give her skills, and then she could go out and start her own company, and they are supporting her. And women who guide for the Ladakhi Women's Travel Company also guide for her. And that's a really good example of how providing these education opportunities and doorways into the industry then allow women to start their own companies and continue growing and empowering others, and it just continues branching out. And I met Dolma because she ran my favorite restaurant in Leh in Ladakh, and so the food on the trek was really, really good. We had buckwheat pancakes and homemade apricot jam every morning, which I was a big fan of, rather than just lentils and rice, which is what we ate a lot of the time. Some lessons that I took away from India were the importance of mentorship and having women to look up to as role models. And then also the importance of economic empowerment, that being able to get a job that's profitable and also being able to start your own company is really, really important for women being able to have independence and be able to make their own choices. And then also the choice between family and career, which keeps coming up as a theme over and over again, as women have to decide to stay in the industry or get married and have a family. And it's quite often a trade-off between those two. After India, I headed to Nepal, and I went there to trek with Three Sisters Adventure Trekking, which is a pioneering women's guiding company founded by three sisters, Lucky, Dicky, and Nikki. And they created a training program through their NGO, Empowering Women of Nepal, because when they started, there were hardly any women working as guides at all. And so they needed to provide the framework and the training to tell women that they could be guides, which was groundbreaking, and also to provide the skills necessary for women to be able to do it. So the way that it works is you start with classroom time, and then you work as a porter and carry gear for clients while learning the routes to take on the treks, and also learning how to take care of clients and how to be a good guide. These are some of the women who were working as porters and were kind of guides in training on the trek that I went on. And these are some of the other guides. I, at 5'11", was clearly a lot taller than the average Nepali woman. And what I thought was interesting is that the Three Sisters trekking company did hire male guides. And in my trek, there were two head guides, a woman and a man. And the woman was very clearly in charge of everything. She knew all the details. But whenever we'd show up at a tea house to check in for the night, which is where you stay in villages as you're doing these circuit treks, the tea house owners would immediately talk to the man, and his main role seemed to be being the face of leadership and being the intermediary between the women who are actually in control and the tea house owners, who were usually men as well. And in order for the women to be taken seriously by the tea house owners or the other communities along the trail, they really had to prove themselves and work way harder. And that theme also kept coming up over and over again, where you could gain respect, but it took a lot of work and you had to be perfect and just always on and better than the men had to be. They were just assumed to be leaders right from the beginning with no additional work. There was also an aspect of differences in the type of labor that people were doing that really became quite clear in Nepal, because some of the people working as guides were there talking to the clients and walking with them and not carrying that much weight. And some people were working as porters, where you're carrying gear and food and sometimes clothing for clients. And at Three Sisters, they would have many, many porters out at once, and they were all carrying about the same amount of weight that you would expect to carry if you went on a backpacking trip where you're self-sustaining. But most of the other guiding companies would try to hire the fewest people possible because it's cheaper and have them carry huge amounts of weight. And while Three Sisters provided clothing for the porters to wear that they could take out when they went and worked on a job, most of the guiding companies didn't. And so people would be walking in clothing that was really not warm enough or well suited for the conditions. And it emphasized to me that some people choose to be guides or to work in the outdoors because they love it and they want to have the experience of trekking and spending all their time outside and being able to pass on the empowerment mental health benefits of being outside to others. And some people have to do it because it's the only job that's available to them. And that's the case a lot of the time with porters, because if you don't have language skills or you don't have the ability to work a customer service job, the education necessary to go and get a higher education, you can end up doing that job, and then it's just manual labor, and there's a big aspect of exploitation and not paying them enough for the huge amount of work that they're doing. For the second half of my time in Nepal, I had the opportunity to help with a small documentary about one of the women who works as a guide for three sisters. Her name's Durga. And we went and visited Durga's hometown. We went to her village. And it's actually such an uncommon tourist destination that we made Nepali national news. They did a feature story on why no one is going to Rara Lake as tourists, and we were part of the footage, us getting off this little plane landing near the lake. And it was a really cool experience to get to meet a guide working in Pokhara, one of the biggest cities in Nepal, and then go see her home and meet her family and see what life is like and where she came from and what her journey was to become a guide. And in the film, I play a trekking tourist, which was a role I felt very qualified for at that point after having been doing nothing but trekking for 3 months. So this is a shot that is from the film. And they're still crowdfunding on I Fund Women. So you can go support the film if you would like and help it reach more audiences through film festivals. And this is me with Durga, and you can see some women in the background working in the fields. And that's where she came from, and she would walk to get transportation to go into Pokhara. And most of the women will spend most of the time during the trekking season just living in Pokhara and guiding, and you never know how long you're going to be out for or how many days you're going to get of work. And so you spend a lot of time away from your home and away from your family. So it is a big choice and a big sacrifice to decide to pursue that as a career. Some big lessons from Nepal. We're thinking about worker exploitation and how the trucking industry really needs to be a lot better at supporting local people. And also conditional leadership, that women can be accepted as leaders, but it's conditional on working harder and being better and never letting your guard down. And then the aspect of education, and that theme also comes up over and over again, that you need these opportunities for women to see that they can be guides, and then to get the skills and training necessary to do the job. And it seemed that when there were fewer certifications necessary and becoming a guide just meant asserting, I'm a guide now, there were far more men who were willing to do that than there were women. Probably a lot because of social conditioning to not be bold and to see that a woman's role isn't to be a leader. And education can help counteract that. After Nepal, I headed to Thailand, and I started in the north, where I met Kat, who co-founded the Chiang Mai Rock Climbing Adventures gym and guiding company. And she's responsible for bolting a lot of the rock climbing routes, areas like Crazy Horse, which is really well known in northern Thailand. And she emphasizes environmental education taught through climbing, and also creating sustainable relationships between tourists who come to climb and the local people. So teaching the tourists how to respect the environment and not litter, and work with the government to make sure we're able to keep climbing areas open, and then working with the villagers to help them take advantage of tourists coming in to help their economy, but also not have their economy revolve around the tourists, because things like COVID can happen and then the whole economy collapses. And that's a huge problem that all of these people are facing right now, since the trucking industry is essentially non-existent when you can't travel and when it's not safe to be in close proximity with people. I then headed to southern Thailand, and I met up with Jane, who owns the Rayleigh Rock Climbing Shop. And she was a member of the Thai national team for climbing, and she was ranked the best female climber in Thailand. and she was the only guide working as the only female guide working in Rayleigh in this whole really popular climbing area still. And she basically fell in love with climbing when she visited a friend who was working there at a beach. And she started working at restaurants and asking climbing guides to teach her in exchange for her carrying their ropes for them. And that's how she taught herself. And it really took a lot for her to be able to get the opportunity to learn how to climb and then to be able to open her own shop. And it takes people trailblazing to be the first in, and then hopefully others can follow behind them. What I learned from Jane and Kat is that a big reason that there are fewer women guiding in Thailand, or even rock climbing or hiking or doing other activities, is because of really strict beauty standards, where you're not supposed to have strong arms, you're not supposed to spend time outside and have your tan skin. You are supposed to always have your nails look nice. They were all way, way better at taking selfies than me. And everyone always seemed to look perfect. And that is a huge part of what you're supposed to do as a woman. And so anything that interferes with that is considered to be a big risk. And there's also a big fear of the danger of rock climbing or doing any kind of outdoor activity, that you could fall and hurt yourself. And every year there are people who try to climb and don't know how to use the ropes appropriately and do get hurt or die. And those stories get told over and over again. And so people are very afraid to start trying these outdoor activities. And then another big reason is because the culture of rock climbing and outdoor activities in general is extremely dominated by men. Most of the guides are men from age 20 to 30, and they have a very tight-knit group with a strong culture that is seeped in masculinity. And so breaking into that, you have to be very dedicated and you have to be very skilled and very confident. And without strong training programs to help people prepare, very few women want to take that on. And so it continues being a really male-dominated space. After that, I headed to South America and I went to Chile. And in Chile, I went to Torres del Paine with Peak Explorations, which is a guiding company founded by Marinelle de Jesus. And she also founded the Porter Voice Collective, which is working to tell the stories of porters working in Peru, Nepal, and Tanzania. And the trip was supposed to be a women's empowerment trip. We were supposed to have a female guide, but we ended up not. We ended up just having 2 male guides. And this was our group of people from many different parts of the world. China and New Zealand and the US. And it was a really great and fun experience. And there were other young women on the trip, one of whom started Brown Girls Climb. So it was really great to talk with Bethany and learn more about what's happening in the US, which I'd read about and experienced myself, but wasn't specifically researching on this fellowship. But I definitely saw how having male guides can have an impact on the experience when you're trekking. So one example is that I wore a dress for part of the time when I was hiking because I thought it would be fun, and it was a wool dress and I wanted to test out how it worked. And one of the men who was on the trip commented, "Oh, did you put that on for me?" No, I didn't change my clothing for you. But there was no one else there who called him out. And if I'd been there with a whole group of men, I would have felt pretty unsafe in that situation. And also we discussed how if you got your period or if you had never spent time outside and didn't know how to go to the bathroom, or didn't feel comfortable pulling your pants all the way down to go to the bathroom, if you don't have a woman there who you can turn to and ask, "Hey, can I borrow a tampon?" or what do I need to do? It would be a very scary situation, especially when your guides are from a different culture and you don't know what's going to be culturally appropriate. And when the culture is quite steeped in machismo, this male dominant kind of aggressive culture of male leadership. And so having a woman can be a really important feature of it. And we did end up finding some women's empowerment moments, but that was definitely not what the whole trip was. And that helped me understand why it can be so important to hire women and how that shapes the experience of the trip, particularly for women, but also for everyone who is involved. The guides that we had were great though, and they taught me a lot about the sustainable development of the tourism industry in Torres del Paine, and how in India the most sustainable thing to do was to stay in homestay treks, where you're staying in villages along the way and paying local families to basically stay in their guest rooms. But in Torres del Paine, the refugios were usually owned by really wealthy families that had been making money off of the park for a really long time. And so the most sustainable thing to do as far as supporting community members was actually probably to hire people to trek with you and to cook for you, so that you didn't just continue putting money into the pockets of people who already had a lot, based off of the tourism that comes to the park. And also about how to have the lightest possible impact as far as development goes on the park, and trying to keep it a place that people would be able to visit for generations. And the machismo culture was a huge influence on women being able to be hired, where you really, really had to already have the experience of guiding difficult treks in order to be hired to guide another one. And so if you are starting out as a woman, it's really hard to get a chance. So a lot of the women who were guiding in Torres del Paine were actually from Europe and had been able to get experience guiding in different places. Or people will go to Peru or to Argentina and gain guiding experience there, or gain a certification there, and then come back and guide in Chile, because it's really difficult to get hired to guide the more difficult treks without doing that first. Then the last country I was able to visit before COVID was Argentina. And in Argentina, I met the woman who started Mujeres a la Cumbre, and they guide expeditions out of Argentina in Spanish. One of the projects they did that I thought was really, really cool is that they guided the Cholitas in Aconcagua. And the Cholitas are from Bolivia, and it's this group of women who hikes in their traditional clothing, to prove that women can climb mountains. And the Mujeres a la Cumbre group actually worked with the Cholitas to bring them up Aconcagua, and then they brought women from Argentina to Bolivia to have the Cholitas lead them on a trip as well, which the Cholitas were really nervous about leading, but apparently they did a great job, and it was a really amazing trip for everyone who was able to go on it. They also have partnered with Three Sisters in Nepal, and they've taken women from Argentina on treks on Kilimanjaro. And their big dream is to have an international Aconcagua expedition, where they bring women like all the women who I've talked about in this presentation, who are really passionate about guiding and passionate about climbing mountains, but will never be able to raise enough money from guiding locally to be able to go on big international mountaineering expeditions. They want to bring women like that together to do a big climb of one of the tallest mountains in the world, the tallest mountain in the world outside of Asia. And I was able to meet them, and I went to Argentina because I went on an expedition in Aconcagua with AW Expeditions, which is run by Sunny Strauer, and she has the women's fastest known time for the route that we did. It took us about 18 days, and she did it in just under 2 days, going straight, which is very, very impressive. And she carried so much weight and was just absolutely incredible as a guide. And she also hired a local woman to support us in the summit push day as well, and really made an effort to make sure that we were supporting the local people as much as possible. While we were there, we were the only all-woman team on the mountain, one of very few during the whole season, and we were pretty constantly reminded of that. On my first day on the mountain, I went on a acclimatization hike and asked some guys who were coming down how their trip was and asked them for advice. And they made such a big show of being shocked that I was there to climb the mountain and that I wasn't just going for a little walk, because how could a young woman be trying to climb a mountain? What a surprise. And when we started out with all of our gear on a route that you would only really be doing if you were trying to summit, the other trips, which were all men, asked us if we were trekking into base camp or if we were going for a quick hike. And no, we were there on an expedition just like everyone else was, but we had to keep explaining that and proving ourselves. And finally, after about 5 days of being with all these groups, they definitely respected our abilities, but we had to prove ourselves first. And that's something that men have to experience much less often. So we did leave Camp 2 in the snowstorm and in the 15-mile-an-hour gusts. This is me hiking between Camp 2 and Camp 3 up to about 20,000 feet. Got my down puffy pants on because it was very chilly. And then on the left is from the summit push day, and I ended up getting altitude sickness and turning around at about 22,000 feet. But it was an amazing experience to get to spend 2 nights above the altitude of the summit of Kilimanjaro and be able to see so much of the world, the most incredible sunrises and sunsets that I think I've ever seen. And then the picture on the right is me with all of my gear hiking down from Camp 3 to base camp on the other side. And we had probably about 50 pounds on our backs, which really gave me an additional appreciation for the work that the porters do, because it felt very, very heavy. And lessons that I took away from Argentina are that women are strong and we can carry large amounts of weight. I actually learned that women's bodies are better at cold expeditions in particular because we hold fat better. So men will come out of an expedition looking all rugged, and women will come out looking about the same as when they went in. And also our feet adapt well to carrying extra weight because our bodies are designed for pregnancy. And so in some ways, from the physiological level, actually women might be better mountaineers than men, although the narrative is almost always the other direction, that men are stronger and therefore are more suited to rugged terrain or cold weather. I also learned about how there are other ways to experience nature. It doesn't necessarily need to be trying to climb the biggest thing possible. And I thought a lot about how that narrative of defeating a mountain or trying to get to the summit is based in a pretty masculine idea of what outdoor exploration is, also based in a colonial idea of exploring new territory and claiming it for yourself by making it to the summit. And that doing things like going for a hike or a picnic or just spending time outside with friends can have a lot of the same benefits as going on a big expedition like Aconcagua, and that it's awesome that more women are able to experience that. And I want everyone who wants to experience that to be able to, but also not everyone needs to. And there shouldn't be any pressure that you need to go like spend 2 weeks puking at 18,000 feet in order to be able to experience the outdoors or go on a hike. But at the same time, doing something like that can be absolutely life-changing. It can make you feel so strong, and like every struggle that you face in your daily life, you can handle because you know that you've done something that's harder. And that was definitely my experience after pushing myself really hard and being able to experience where my limit is. Turns out it's at 22,000 feet on Aconcagua. After 8 months of traveling and meeting all of these amazing women and people from around the world, I came back to my questions and started thinking about if I had come up with answers to any of them. And I don't know that I have clear, succinct answers to any of the questions that I set out to explore, but I definitely came back with a lot of lessons that I learned. And those lessons have definitely influenced the way that I think about the world and the way that I think about my experiences in the outdoors and what I want to be doing in the future. And I know there's so much more to learn, so many more places where women are breaking barriers, and also so much more to explore in terms of intersections of identities understanding that gender is really a social construct, something that we have defined, and that so many of the struggles that women face are because of the narratives that society tells us and also that we tell ourselves, and that we can push through that and try to understand more deeply what's going on there in a way that will make everyone be able to have the experiences that they hopefully want to. I did take away a couple of realizations about how important it is to have diverse guides in the outdoor industry and leaders in every industry. Part of it is so that people feel comfortable when you're going outside, especially if you have little outdoor experience. You can often feel a lot safer with guides who share your past experiences, where you know that they're going to be able to understand your struggle and they're going to be able to help you and help you get through those experiences and grow. And also an element of inspiration, where, for example, if I'm climbing with a group of men and they all can do a hard climb, I'll tell myself, oh, well, just because they can do it doesn't mean that I can. But if I see someone who looks like me and who has the same body type as me do the climb, then I think, okay, it's possible for me. It's something that's within my reach if I try hard. And that experience happens in so many different elements of identity, not just gender or body type. And so having diverse representation of people doing outdoor activities and guiding outdoor activities is really important to making the space more accessible. And it also creates more space for leadership, because there isn't this constant need to be proving yourself in order to prove that you deserve to be in that space, which often happens if you're the only one there representing your identity. If you're the only woman or the only person of color or the only person that's part of the LGBTQIA community, then you often are being forced to represent that community and make sure that you're always pushing as hard as you possibly can in order to prove that you belong. And when you're with all people who are in your community, you have the freedom to explore and to express yourself in different ways and not feel like it's gonna have this huge negative impact on you or other people who are part of the same group as you. There's also a better ability to handle specific issues, for example, periods in the outdoors or peeing in the woods or microaggressions that come up often, but that guides who have less experience or who don't share those identities or have an understanding of those identities won't know how to respond to or won't know how to help you and make you feel comfortable. And then also to just build community and be able to share these incredible journeys and struggles with people who can then become lifelong friends. And if you're starting from some aspect of a shared background, it's much easier to do that, even if that background is just a love of being outside and a love of having adventures in the mountains. I also have some takeaways of what you can do. You can hire guides that are from diverse backgrounds. You can make sure that you're hiring women and book trips with companies that hire women. And also you can book directly with a guide when possible and try to focus on booking with guides who are actually from the area where you're going. So that way you're supporting the local community that's being exploited in a lot of ways by the increase in guiding and the increase in tourism, and making sure that the money is actually going back to those people. Especially during COVID-19 times, you can try to support guiding companies in different ways. So you can purchase gear from them, or even just make a donation, which a lot of social impact companies are accepting right now, especially because there really isn't going to be a trekking season this year. And a lot of the companies that I've talked about are really at risk of ceasing to exist. And if they cease to exist, it's going to be really difficult to get them started again. When you are able to travel again, you can think deeply about where you stay and where you spend your money when you're in small mountain communities, trying to keep your money staying as locally as possible. So booking with homestays or locally owned Airbnb, well, bed and breakfast, to try to keep your money as local as possible. Sometimes Airbnb is good because you can book directly with families, but it's also going through a big corporation. So if you can do it directly, that's always better. And then asking questions of the guiding companies that you book with or that you're interested in booking with. to see what their policies are for how they treat their porters. If they don't have policies for that, then you probably shouldn't book with them until they do. And dig deep and ask the questions that that matter to you, because if we aren't asking the questions as clients, then it's really unlikely that they're ever going to change. And also tip your guides and porters well, because they're doing really hard work and aren't being paid nearly enough for it. That concludes my presentation, and now, thank you. Now we can open it up for some questions. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I'd love to take some questions that anyone has about the presentation.
I've got it unmuted. I just want to know how.
You should be able to just talk to her.
Does anyone have a question or have an experience to share of?
I do.
Hi.
We have traveled quite a lot, and we have used guides quite a lot. However, our last experience in Ecuador gave us food for thought, and your suggestion to tip well brought that to mind, because we are, as tourists, we are targets, and we carry large amounts of cash because of the tipping expectation. And I wish that guiding companies could just pay their guides well enough that they didn't have to expect tourists to tip, and thus have us carry lots of cash around in these foreign countries. We had some friends who were held up at gunpoint, and it brought that to our attention. So I don't know if you correspond with these people or not. I know it's a practice that's prevalent throughout the world, but if we could offer to tip ahead of time, or do it when we book our trip, as part of the initial expenses, it might save some lives and loss of personal possessions and everything else as a result.
Yeah, definitely. That is definitely a very good point. And the pressure to tip also can make just the experience of checking worse, because you're trying to figure out how much you're supposed to tip. No one ever really tells you, and trying to decide how to split it as a group. I definitely agree. It would be much easier if all of the fees and all of the expected tipping was included in the price. A big reason that happens, from what I've been told, at least in Nepal, is because companies often just hire porters when they arrive at the very last minute. And so it's not like the porters are full-time employees of the company. And so it's really a payment that's more direct between you as a client and the person who's hired just to carry your things for that short period of time. And then instead of going back to the city where the guiding company is based, the porters will often just cycle immediately back to the beginning of the trek to start again. But there are definitely different ways to handle that would definitely be better for the porters and for the trekkers as well. And sometimes you're able to get back to the city before you pay the porters too, and then you can keep your money safer somewhere.
Hopefully. Yes, true.
Other questions?
Hi, Charlotte. So I loved your presentation. I don't know if I'm jumping ahead on the queue.
Go for it.
Okay. So I was wondering what the most unexpected part of your trip was. So I know that I'm sure you had expectations going in of what these treks were going to be like, or what it was going to be like for women in these communities. So I'm just wondering what the biggest surprise was for you.
That's a great question. Well, a lot didn't go to plan. Like, I did not plan to go to Aconcagua. I didn't plan to go to Thailand. There was a lot that just happened as I met new people and found new leads to take. I would say I was pretty surprised at the number of women who are working as guides in India, because I'd heard that the Ladakh Women's Travel Company was really unique. And then it turned out there were a lot of women who were working as guides, mostly clustered around training facilities. And I really think there's a link between the educational component of learning to guide in an official way, where you are taught step by step and then you leave with this certification, and women feeling comfortable proclaiming themselves as guides and working as guides. That was definitely a big surprise. And then another one was just, I'd never really been on a guided trek before, and it's very, very different from backpacking or going on a self-supported trip. You weren't really alone. You were with a big group of people moving from town to town, and there were showers and cooked food that was very nice, and it was not a wilderness experience, but still beautiful and a lot more of a cultural experience as well, which was really great to experience. There's a question, what practice did you experience abroad that you wish was emulated in the US? That's a great question. I think a lot of the on the ground training that is available, like through the model Three Sisters use, would be great in the US. There's not really very much portering that happens in the US, or very many opportunities to trek from hut to hut, or be able to spend time outside hiking without camping in a tent, and that makes it a lot less accessible. So opportunities to have people be trained by being in a porter type role, and then making it more accessible for people who can't carry heavy weights to be able to go on trips, and who don't want to sleep in tents to be able to do something that's quite similar to a backpacking trip would be very cool. And part of why we have less of that here, I think, is just because we haven't had people living here as long. Like, that's very plentiful in Europe, but there's also way fewer huge wilderness areas because people have started settling everywhere. And here we still have these really big expanses, which has made it not as necessary to, or not as accessible to do like village to village treks, because towns are just further apart. Lisa, do you have a question?
I do. I was really excited to see your presentation, Charlotte, and in part because, we spent a lot of time together probably 2 years ago kind of envisioning this, and it's so marvelous to see how it unfolded for you. And I'm wondering what you learned about yourself on this journey. You learned a lot about climbing and the guide industry and women doing really challenging work. And I'm wondering what you learned about yourself that you will carry with you.
Yeah, a big takeaway for me was about how you don't need to be climbing mountains to be spending time outside. I definitely went into it feeling this need to be the hardest core mountaineer possible, so that people would want to take me on their trips, or so that I could have some authority to assert myself as someone worth talking to, or someone worthy of conducting these interviews. And I slowly got over that over the course of the year. And I found that I really enjoyed doing circuit treks, or doing through hikes where you're seeing all this beautiful land and meeting all these people, and it's not necessarily about pushing your body to the absolute limit to try to make it somewhere really high. That's a rather arbitrary point. And that is a big takeaway for me. Other questions?
I have a question for you.
Yeah.
I've noticed that I've been more surprised when male groups are not acting surprised. that I'm outside doing something male in the male dominated realm. Did you ever experience this, and like what was, if you did, what was the most surprising time that this happened?
That's a good question. I think because I was going to places that had pretty developed tourism industries, guides were pretty used to Western women coming in and wanting to guide, or sorry, wanting to go on mountaineering trips or wanting to rock climb. And for example, in India, I found that I was treated really differently than my friends who are from India who wanted to go rock climbing or wanted to go mountaineering. And so I think that intersection of different identities played a big role in me wanting to go on a expedition on a 6,000-meter peak or something, to not be seen as odd by the guides. Also, they were very happy to take my money, so they did not question it. And maybe I would have expected a little bit more of that, but I also definitely found that on treks where you're just hiking from village to village, it was pretty normal for there to be women hiking it from all different backgrounds and all different parts of the world. Just having women be guiding it was really, really uncommon, especially local Nepali women. And the higher up that I got in expeditions, the less common it was to be there as a woman. And my experience has also been that in rock climbing, I've gotten less surprised that I'm there to climb. But there's definitely a lot of gender bias in rock climbing too, where something like 67% of women reported feeling unwelcome at times in rock climbing gyms versus somewhere in the low 20s for men. So, and that's statistics from the US, but it's probably a pretty universal experience, I would say. Oh, there's a question about the fellowship itself. Yeah, so the Thomas J. Watson Fellowship, you have to be graduating from one of 41 partner schools. And so if you are attending one of them, you can look up on the website and see if you are. And then you apply during your senior year, and there's an interview process and an application, and you apply with a project that you are very passionate about pursuing and that fits into your past life experiences. So something that you have a history of interest in, and it's a pretty amazing opportunity to just get to travel and explore that without there being a really strict structure to it. There's no requirement to produce a research paper or something like that at the end. If you don't go to one of the partner schools, there are other opportunities like it. Like you could apply for a research Fulbright, where you can go to just one country. And there's also some grants through National Geographic where you can do kind of similar projects. But definitely look for fellowships. They're great. Okay, another question. Were the guides from more government organizations or more private? And how can we increase women guides given this? So all of the guides that I worked with were from private guiding companies. And sometimes the training programs had some government funding, like some of the programs in India, they were subsidized by the government because they were trying to promote the tourism industry. But it was all private. And so one really clear way that we can do that is by using our purchasing power. If you're gonna go and travel and go on a trek like this, insisting that you have a woman guide. I had a couple of experiences. Well, one was in Peru, which I didn't end up getting to go because of COVID. But at first I asked the company if I could have a woman as my guide, and they said no. And then I said, okay, well, I'm only gonna come if you can find a woman to be my guide. And after 4 or 5 emails back and forth, they found a woman. So there are people there. It just might be a little bit more work for the guiding company. And if you insist and you make it clear that they're not going to get your business if they don't meet the standards that you're setting, whether that be getting a woman, or making sure that you have weight limits for the porters that are going with you or something like that, they will usually make it happen. And if everyone did that, the industry would shift. Question about the climbing and trekking to be dangerous. Did I feel that danger, and did I have scary experiences? I did have a couple of scary experiences that were all more related to the men than the mountains. I would say lots of catcalling, lots of feeling unsafe in housing situations where I would move and stay somewhere else. I never felt too unsafe mountain climbing. The closest would probably be concerned about altitude sickness, particularly in Aconcagua because we were really high up. But the mountain climbing that I was doing was mostly just trekking. So it was just walking, never needing a rope or a harness for what I was doing while I was traveling. So that was not too big of a risk. Did you find that ethical practices were predominantly used by women where you were hiking? Definitely not universally. There were some women who were just starting a guiding company exactly the same as the way all the men were running theirs. But I did find often that if a guiding company was set up to be a social enterprise where part of their marketing tactic was to say, we are the ethical people to trek with, then they would usually have much higher sustainability standards and also be employing women and also be treating their porters better. And that could look like carrying out the trash instead of burning it at base camp, trying to make sure that you're getting all of the money put back into the local community, having some volunteer opportunities for you to get to know local people while you're there. And that is probably also because of the type of clients that they were bringing in. Clients who would go out of their way to make sure that they're getting guided by a woman are also often clients who want sustainable practices as well. And the guiding companies run by women and that hired women also usually were more expensive to go with, maybe sometimes twice as expensive. And you pay for the ethical practices because they cost money, which is why they're not happening universally. Did you get a chance to talk with the porters and maybe learn about the impact of carrying on their health and some ideas and their thoughts and tools to assist with their trade? Yeah, so there are definitely health impacts from carrying that much weight over time. There's also problems with their housing and with the food that they're provided. It's usually just the absolute cheapest that can be provided. But it gets really complicated because, and even more complicated now because of COVID, because those still are some of the best paying jobs in the areas where they're working. And so people will make the argument, okay, well, sure, they're working really hard, carrying all this weight, but the alternative is working really hard in the field, and that's going to have the same impact on their bodies, but they're going to make way less money. I'm not sure that I'm totally persuaded by that, and I think that we can do a lot better. But some porters say that is their right to do. It was really difficult to talk directly with porters because most of the people who were working as porters didn't speak any English. And there was also a lot of fear because if you come forward complaining about working conditions and the guiding companies find out about it, they won't hire you again. And so people don't really want to talk about it and don't want to complain about it. Well, we are at 2:00. Is there any last question and then we'll end it? Okay, well, thank you everyone for tuning in. and for watching my presentation, and to everyone who supported me on my year, supported me through the application process. I really, really appreciate it. And I hope that we're all able to get out and go on some treks and have some outdoor experiences in the near future.
Thank you so
Okay.
much.
We appreciate getting to see it.